Tom Reynolds lived a simple, peaceful life in the countryside. His home was nestled at the end of a quiet gravel driveway, surrounded by tall trees and open fields. It wasn't fancy, but it was his sanctuary, a place where he could escape the stress of his demanding job as a state trooper. For over 2 decades, Tom had served his community with pride, earning respect for his calm demeanor and sharp instincts. But when he wasn't wearing his badge, he preferred to be left alone, tending to his garden or fixing up his old pickup truck. On most days, Tom's driveway saw little action. The only vehicles that ever rolled down it were his own or the occasional delivery truck. That's why, one sunny Saturday afternoon, he was surprised to hear loud music blaring from somewhere nearby. Curious, Tom stepped out onto his porch with a cold beer in hand. What he saw made his jaw drop. At the edge of his property, right where his driveway began, there was chaos. Cars were parked haphazardly along both sides of the road, some even spilling onto his land. People milled about, chatting and laughing, while colorful decorations fluttered in the breeze. A large tent had been set up just beyond his driveway, and tables laden with food lined the area. It looked like someone was hosting a massive event, and they were using part of his property to do it. Tom scratched his head, confused. He didn't recall anyone asking permission to use his driveway. In fact, he hadn't spoken to any of his neighbors about hosting an event. As far as he knew, this was all happening without his knowledge or consent. Determined to get answers, Tom grabbed his hat and walked down to investigate. When he reached the edge of his driveway, he spotted a woman directing caterers and shouting instructions into a walkie-talkie. She wore a clipboard around her neck and seemed to be in charge. This, Tom assumed, was the person responsible for the unexpected gathering. Clearing his throat, he approached her cautiously. "Excuse me," Tom said, raising his voice slightly to be heard over the music. "I couldn't help but notice that part of your event seems to be on my property." The woman turned to face him, her expression shifting from irritation to disbelief. "Your property?" she asked, looking him up and down as if sizing him up. "Nobody uses this driveway anyway. We're just borrowing it for today." Tom blinked, taken aback by her dismissive tone. "Borrowing it," he repeated, keeping his voice steady despite his growing frustration. "This is private property. You can't just borrow it without asking." She rolled her eyes dramatically, clearly unimpressed. "Look, we've already started setting everything up. Can't you just let it slide this once? No one's going to care." Tom felt a flicker of annoyance but forced himself to stay calm. He'd dealt with difficult people before. This was nothing new. Still, something about her attitude rubbed him the wrong way. She acted as though rules didn't apply to her, as though her convenience mattered more than his rights as a homeowner. "I'm sorry," Tom replied firmly, "but I can't allow this. My driveway is off limits unless I give permission. And trust me, you didn't ask." The woman crossed her arms, glaring at him. "Fine," she snapped. "Do whatever you want. But don't come crying to me when everyone thinks you're being unreasonable." With that, she stormed off, leaving Tom standing there, shaking his head. He didn't know who she was. But one thing was certain. She had no intention of backing down. Little did she know, neither did he. Tom stood at the edge of his driveway, watching as chaos continued to unfold. The woman, who he later learned was named Karen, had returned to her duties, barking orders at caterers and decorators while completely ignoring him. It was clear she had no plans to move the event off his property. Guests were now parking their cars along the sides of his driveway, treating it like a public lot rather than private land. Frustration bubbled inside Tom, but he didn't let it show on his face. Years of working as a state trooper had taught him how to stay calm under pressure. He knew losing his temper wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he decided to take matters into his own hands in a way that would make his intentions crystal clear. Walking back to his garage, Tom rummaged through some shelves until he found what he needed: bright orange traffic cones and a roll of official-looking caution tape. These were tools he used occasionally for work, and they always carried an air of authority. If Karen refused to listen to reason, maybe she'd understand a more visual message. With methodical precision, Tom placed the cones across the entrance to his driveway, forming a neat blockade. Then he stretched the caution tape between them, creating a barrier that left no room for misinterpretation. To anyone passing by, it looked like the driveway was officially closed. Because it was. Satisfied with his handiwork, Tom stepped back to admire his work. It didn't take long for people to notice. A few guests who had been heading toward the driveway stopped in their tracks, looking confused. One man tried to duck under the tape, only to hesitate when he saw the stern expression on Tom's face. "Sorry," Tom said simply, gesturing toward the sign he'd taped to one of the cones. Asterisk, private property. No trespassing asterisk. The man muttered something under his breath and quickly retreated. Word spread fast among the crowd. Soon, a small group gathered near the blocked-off area, whispering and pointing. Some seemed amused, others annoyed, but none of them dared to cross the line Tom had drawn. Even the caterers paused mid-delivery, unsure whether to unload supplies so close to the disputed zone. Karen, however, wasn't about to let this stand. When she finally noticed the commotion, she stormed over, her heels sinking slightly into the gravel. Her face was red with anger, and she jabbed a finger in Tom's direction. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "It means exactly what it says," Tom replied calmly, meeting her glare with a steady gaze. "This is my driveway, and I'm not allowing anyone to use it without permission. You can't just block off access," Karen exclaimed, throwing up her arms. "People need to park here. Do you have any idea how much effort went into planning this event?" Tom raised an eyebrow. "I'm sure it was a lot of work," he said evenly. "But none of that changes the fact that this is private property. You should have checked before assuming you could use it." Karen scoffed, clearly unwilling to admit fault. "Fine, play hardball if you want," she snapped. "We'll see how long you keep this up." Tom didn't respond. He didn't need to. His barricade spoke for itself, and deep down, Karen must have known she was in the wrong. Still, her stubbornness burned brighter than her common sense. She turned on her heel and marched away, muttering threats under her breath. As the afternoon wore on, tension simmered. Guests whispered amongst themselves, speculating about the standoff. Some sympathized with Tom, agreeing that Karen had overstepped. Others sided with her, thinking Tom was being unnecessarily strict. Meanwhile, Tom remained unfazed, leaning against his porch railing with a cup of coffee in hand. He wasn't going anywhere, and neither was his blockade. Little did Karen know, her next move would escalate things far beyond what either of them expected. Karen wasn't the type to back down easily, especially when she felt wronged, or, more accurately, inconvenienced. To her, Tom's actions weren't just frustrating. They were an outright attack on her event, and by extension, her reputation as an event planner. She had spent weeks organizing this wedding reception, meticulously planning every detail to ensure it would be perfect. And now, thanks to some stubborn neighbor and his ridiculous barricade, everything was falling apart. Fuming, Karen retreated to her house, which sat just a short distance from Tom's property. Her mind raced with thoughts of how unfair the situation was. Who did he think he was, blocking off access like that? Didn't he realize how important this day was? In her anger, she decided there was only one thing left to do: call the authorities. Grabbing her phone, Karen dialed 911. As the dispatcher answered, she launched into an impassioned rant. "Hi, yes, I need to report a disturbance," she said, her voice sharp and clipped. "My neighbor is causing problems at my event. He's put up cones and tape across the driveway, refusing to let anyone park there. It's completely unreasonable." The dispatcher listened patiently, asking for details about the location and nature of the issue. Karen described Tom as difficult and uncooperative, painting herself as the victim in the scenario. "He's ruining everything," she exclaimed, her tone dripping with indignation. "I don't know what his problem is, but he needs to stop." Meanwhile, Tom remained blissfully unaware of the call. He was still seated on his porch, sipping coffee and observing the scene from afar. The blockade seemed to be doing its job. Guests were avoiding the driveway altogether, opting to park farther away or cram their cars onto the narrow shoulder of the road. While the inconvenience clearly annoyed some attendees, no one dared to challenge Tom directly. After all, the sight of traffic cones and caution tape gave the impression that someone in authority had made the decision, not just a random homeowner. About 20 minutes later, 2 patrol cars arrived on the scene. Their flashing lights drew immediate attention, turning heads among the guests who were mingling near the tent. Whispers rippled through the crowd as people speculated about what was happening. Was the neighbor really in trouble? Had something serious occurred? Tom spotted the officers stepping out of their vehicles and immediately recognized one of them, Officer Martinez, a young rookie he'd trained during his early days on the force. Martinez looked surprised to see Tom sitting casually on his porch, seemingly unfazed by the commotion. For a moment, the officer hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. This wasn't a typical dispute, and having a senior trooper involved complicated things significantly. Karen, however, wasted no time. Spotting the officers, she hurried over, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. "Thank goodness you're here," she exclaimed, gesturing dramatically toward Tom's driveway. "That man over there is completely out of control. He won't let anyone use the driveway, even though it's not like he actually needs it." Martinez glanced at Tom, then back at Karen, clearly sensing the tension between them. Before Karen could continue her tirade, the second officer stepped forward and asked both parties to explain their sides of the story. Tom rose from his chair, brushing off his jeans as he approached the group. His demeanor was calm and composed, a stark contrast to Karen's frantic energy. Without hesitation, he pulled out his badge, holding it up for the officers to see. "I'm State Trooper Tom Reynolds," he said evenly, "and that driveway belongs to me." The reaction was immediate. Officer Martinez's eyes widened in recognition, while the other officer straightened up, suddenly more attentive. Karen, on the other hand, froze mid-sentence, her mouth hanging open in disbelief. For the first time since the confrontation began, she seemed unsure of herself. Tom went on to explain the situation clearly and concisely, pointing out that Karen had never sought permission to use his property and that the driveway was legally his. He even showed the officers documentation proving ownership. As he spoke, Karen's confidence wavered. She tried to interject, insisting that Tom was being unreasonable, but her arguments sounded weaker now, especially in the presence of law enforcement. For a brief moment, the absurdity of the situation hung in the air. Here was Karen, calling the police on a state trooper for blocking his own driveway . The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all Tom, who struggled to suppress a small smile. This day was turning out to be far more entertaining than he'd anticipated. The tension in the air was palpable as Tom stood face to face with Karen and the 2 officers. Officer Martinez, who had trained under Tom years ago, shifted uncomfortably. He respected Tom immensely, not just because of his rank, but also because of the guidance and wisdom he'd shared during those early days on the force. The rookie officer beside him, however, seemed unsure of how to navigate the situation. After all, it wasn't every day you responded to a call only to find that one of the parties involved was your own superior. Karen, still reeling from the revelation that Tom was a state trooper, tried to regain her footing. "Look," she said, her voice wavering slightly, "I understand he has a badge, but that doesn't mean he can do whatever he wants. This is ridiculous. My guests need access to park their cars, and he's deliberately making things difficult." Tom raised an eyebrow, his expression remaining calm and composed. "Difficult," he repeated, his tone measured. "Ma'am, I'm simply enforcing my rights as a property owner. You're hosting an event on my land without permission. That's not me being difficult. That's you ignoring basic property laws. Officer Martinez stepped forward, clearing his throat. Mr. Reynolds, he began cautiously, can you confirm that this driveway is indeed your private property? Absolutely, Tom replied, pulling out a folder from his back pocket. Inside were copies of his property deed and survey maps, clearly marking the boundaries of his land. He handed them over to Martinez, who scanned the documents quickly before nodding. This confirms it, Martin said, turning to Karen. The driveway falls within Mr. Reynolds' property line. Karen's face flushed red, a mix of embarrassment and anger bubbling to the surface. But no one ever uses it, she protested, throwing her hands up in exasperation. It's just sitting there empty. What harm could it possibly do to let us use it for today? Tom crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. That's not how it works, he explained firmly. If I allowed you to use my property without permission, it would set a precedent. Next time, someone else might assume they can do the same thing. Private property means exactly that. It's private. It's not up for negotiation. Martinez nodded in agreement, stepping fully into his role as mediator. Ms. Miller, he said gently, the law is pretty clear on this. Mr. Reynolds has every right to block access to his driveway. There's nothing we can do to override that. Karen opened her mouth to argue further, but the words caught in her throat. For the first time since the confrontation began, she realized she was fighting a losing battle. The weight of the situation, and the presence of two uniformed officers, finally sank in. Still, she couldn't bring herself to admit defeat outright. Instead, she shot Tom a glare filled with thinly veiled resentment. Well, if this is how you want to handle things, she muttered, folding her arms tightly across her chest, then fine, but don't expect me to apologize. Tom shrugged nonchalantly. Apology or not, I'm not moving the cones. If you'd like to discuss using my property in the future, we can talk about it, after today of course, but for now, the driveway stays closed. With that, the matter was settled, at least legally. Officer Martinez exchanged a knowing glance with his partner before turning back to Tom. Everything looks good here, sir, he said respectfully. Let us know if there are any further issues. As the officers returned to their patrol cars, the crowd of guests began to disperse, many of them whispering among themselves. Some looked sympathetic toward Tom, while others appeared frustrated by the inconvenience. A few even approached him to apologize on behalf of Karen, though Tom brushed it off with a polite smile. No hard feelings, he told them. Just doing what I have to do. Karen, meanwhile, stood fuming near the tent, watching as the officers drove away. Her grand event, the one she'd worked so hard to perfect, was unraveling before her eyes. Guests were leaving earlier than planned, irritated by the lack of parking and the overall drama. The once elegant celebration now felt chaotic and disjointed, thanks largely to her refusal to respect boundaries. For Tom, the whole ordeal was both amusing and exhausting. He hadn't asked for any of this, but he wasn't about to compromise his principles either. As he walked back to his porch, he couldn't help but chuckle softly to himself, calling the cops on a state trooper, blocking his own driveway. If nothing else, this story would make for great conversation at the next family gathering. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the field, the atmosphere at Karen's event grew increasingly tense. The standoff with Tom had become the talk of the party, and not in a good way. Guests who had come expecting an elegant evening were now caught in the middle of what felt like a neighborhood feud. Some tried to brush it off as a minor inconvenience, while others couldn't hide their irritation. Karen paced back and forth near the tent, her clipboard clutched tightly in one hand. She was furious, not just at Tom, but at herself for letting things spiral so far out of control. Her mind raced with thoughts of how to salvage the situation. Should she try reasoning with him again? No, that clearly wasn't going to work. Could she move everything closer to her house instead? Too late for that. The caterers and decorations were already set up. The irony of the situation gnawed at her. Here she was, hosting what was supposed to be a flawless wedding reception, and instead it was turning into a disaster, all because of some gravel driveway. But more than anything, it was the humiliation that stunned the most. Dozens of people had witnessed her losing an argument with a man who turned out to be a state trooper. If there was one thing Karen hated, it was looking foolish in front of others. Meanwhile, Tom sat on his porch, observing the chaos from a distance. He wasn't gloating, at least not outwardly, but he couldn't deny feeling a sense of vindication. This whole mess could have been avoided if Karen had simply asked permission or shown even a shred of respect for his property. Instead, she bulldozed ahead, assuming that her needs outweighed everyone else's rights. Now she was reaping what she'd sown. As the evening wore on, the trickle of departing guests turned into a steady stream. Many cited the lack of parking as their reason for leaving early, though others admitted they were uncomfortable being part of such a contentious scene. One couple even approached Tom as they left, thanking him for standing his ground. "We don't blame you for doing what you did," the wife said kindly. "People shouldn't ignore boundaries like that." Tom nodded graciously. "Thanks for understanding," he replied. "I didn't ask for any of this, but I'm not gonna back down when someone's breaking the rules." By the time darkness fell, the once bustling event area had thinned considerably. Tables that had been filled with laughter and conversation earlier in the day now sat half empty, abandoned plates and glasses scattered across them. The band played listlessly, their upbeat tunes clashing with the somber mood. Even the bride and groom seemed subdued, retreating to a quiet corner of the tent to avoid the growing awkwardness. Finally, Karen approached Tom one last time. Her earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a mix of exhaustion and defeat. Standing at the edge of his driveway, she hesitated before speaking. "Look," she began, her voice softer than before, "I know I messed up. I should have checked about the property lines before planning all this. I'm sorry." Tom studied her for a moment, weighing her apology. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, though it was clear the admission didn't come easily. "Apology accepted," he said finally. "But next time, think twice before using someone else's land without asking. Respect goes a long way." Karen nodded, relief washing over her face. "Yeah, lesson learned," she muttered. Then, after a pause, she added, "If I ever plan another event around here, can I at least ask you first?" Tom chuckled softly. "Sure, you can ask. And depending on the circumstances, we might be able to work something out. But fair warning, I'll expect compensation if you're using my property." To his surprise, Karen managed a small smile. "Fair enough," she said. With that, she turned and walked back toward the tent, shoulders slumped but visibly lighter. For Tom, the confrontation was officially over. As he leaned back in his chair and watched the remnants of the party wind down, he reflected on the day's events. It hadn't been pleasant, but it reinforced something he'd always believed. Standing up for yourself and your rights was worth the effort, no matter how inconvenient it might seem in the moment. The aftermath of the chaotic wedding reception left a lasting impression on everyone involved, especially Karen. What had started as a glamorous event filled with laughter and celebration ended in disarray, largely due to her refusal to respect boundaries. As the remaining guests trickled out, some offering awkward goodbyes, while others avoided eye contact altogether, Karen felt the weight of the day's failures pressing down on her. She spent hours cleaning up the mess, dismantling tents, packing away decorations, and hauling trash bags to the curb. It was grueling work, made worse by the knowledge that much of the chaos could have been avoided if she'd handled things differently. Every crumpled napkin and overturned chair seemed to mock her poor decisions. By the time she finally collapsed onto her couch late that night, exhaustion and regret had taken over. For Tom, life returned to its usual rhythm almost immediately. The next morning, he woke up early, brewed a pot of coffee, and enjoyed the quiet solitude of his porch. His driveway was clear once again, the barricade removed after the event ended. To him, the incident was already fading into the background, just another odd chapter in his years of living in the countryside. But the neighborhood buzzed with gossip about what had happened. Word spread quickly about how Karen had called the cops on a state trooper for blocking his own driveway. People couldn't stop talking about it. Karen, on the other hand, found herself replaying the confrontation in her mind. She realized now how entitled she had sounded when she dismissed Tom's concerns. Her assumption that no one used the driveway or cared about it had blinded her to the bigger picture. Private property meant something, even if it wasn't actively being utilized. This realization hit hard, forcing her to confront her own behavior. Over the following days, Karen made an effort to repair not only the damage to her reputation, but also her relationship with Tom. One afternoon, she baked a pie, a small gesture of goodwill, and walked it over to his house. When Tom answered the door, he looked surprised but accepted the gift with a nod. "Thanks," he said simply, stepping aside to let her speak. "I just wanted to say I'm really sorry again," Karen began, fidgeting nervously. "I know I acted like I didn't care about your rules, and that wasn't fair. I've learned my lesson. Trust me." Tom studied her for a moment before responding. "Apologies are good," he said evenly, "but actions matter more. If you want to make this right, show me you mean it by respecting boundaries moving forward." Karen nodded earnestly. "I will. And, well, I'll pay attention to details next time. No shortcuts." Her sincerity seemed genuine, and Tom appreciated her effort. He invited her to sit for a few minutes, and they talked about the importance of communication and mutual respect. For Karen, it was a humbling experience, but also a valuable learning opportunity. She left feeling lighter, knowing she'd taken the first step toward making amends. As weeks passed, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. The drama of the blocked driveway became a distant memory, though it remained a favorite topic of lighthearted conversation at community gatherings. Some joked about Karen's infamous trooper takedown, while others praised Tom for standing firm. Through it all, both parties emerged wiser from the experience. For Karen, the lesson went beyond property lines. She understood now that entitlement and arrogance could ruin relationships and tarnish reputations. For Tom, the ordeal reinforced his belief in fairness and integrity. Though he hadn't asked for the conflict, he was glad it had resolved peacefully, and with a newfound understanding between neighbors. In the end, the driveway dispute became more than just a clash over land. It was a reminder that respect, humility, and open communication were essential for harmony in any community. Weeks turned into months, and the once heated conflict between Tom and Karen faded into a distant memory for most of the neighborhood. Life in the countryside returned to its usual peaceful rhythm, with birds chirping in the mornings and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Yet the lessons from that chaotic day lingered quietly beneath the surface, shaping how both Tom and Karen approached their roles as neighbors. Karen, who had initially come across as brash and self-centered, began making subtle changes in her behavior. She started attending local community meetings, something she'd never bothered with before, and even volunteered to help organize a charity bake sale for the town's fire department. At first, some residents were skeptical. After all, they hadn't forgotten the infamous driveway debacle, but Karen's efforts slowly won them over. Her interactions became less about asserting dominance and more about listening and collaborating. One Saturday morning, Tom noticed Karen chatting with other neighbors near the community mailbox. She laughed easily, her tone warm and friendly. It was a stark contrast to the defensive, argumentative woman he'd encountered months earlier. Though they weren't close friends, Tom acknowledged that Karen seemed genuinely committed to improving her relationships within the neighborhood. He respected her willingness to grow, even after such a public misstep. For Tom, life continued much as it always had. His days were filled with routine, tending to his garden, tinkering with his truck, and occasionally heading out on patrol for work. But there was one noticeable difference. He found himself keeping an eye out for Karen during those rare moments when their paths crossed. If she waved hello or stopped to chat briefly, he responded warmly, offering polite conversation and a smile. Their interactions were still brief, but they carried a sense of mutual understanding that hadn't existed before. The real turning point came when Karen decided to host another event, a small outdoor barbecue this time. Determined not to repeat past mistakes, she went out of her way to ensure everything ran smoothly. Days before the gathering, she knocked on Tom's door, clipboard in hand, and asked politely if she could use part of his driveway for overflow parking. "I'll make sure no one damages anything," she promised, her voice steady and sincere. "And I'll clean up afterward, too." Tom raised an eyebrow, amused by the irony of her request. After a moment's pause, he nodded. "All right," he said, leaning against his doorway. "But only because you asked nicely this time." They agreed on a small fee for the use of his property, sealing the deal with a handshake. On the day of the barbecue, Tom watched from his porch as guests arrived, parking neatly along the designated section of his driveway. Karen directed traffic with precision, ensuring no cars strayed beyond the agreed-upon boundaries. The event went off without a hitch, and when it ended, Karen personally oversaw the cleanup crew, sweeping away any stray gravel or debris left behind. Later that evening, she dropped by Tom's house with a plate of grilled chicken and corn on the cob as a token of gratitude. "Thanks for letting me use your driveway," she said, handing him the plate. "I know I didn't exactly start off on the right foot. So, thanks for giving me another chance." Tom accepted the food with a grin. "You're welcome," he replied. "Just remember, communication solves a lot of problems." From then on, their relationship improved significantly. While they weren't likely to become best friends anytime soon, they developed a quiet respect for each other. Karen learned to think twice before making assumptions, while Tom proved that standing firm on principles didn't mean shutting people out entirely. Their story became a testament to the power of patience, accountability, and second chances. As the seasons changed and autumn leaves blanketed the ground, the neighborhood thrived under a renewed sense of harmony. Conversations around backyard fences often drifted back to that fateful summer afternoon, the day Karen called the cops on a state trooper for blocking his own driveway. People chuckled at the absurdity of it all, but they also marveled at how far both parties had come since then. In the end, what started as a clash over property lines evolved into a lesson about humanity itself. Respect, humility, and a willingness to admit fault could bridge even the widest gaps. And though Tom's driveway remained firmly under his control, it had inadvertently brought two very different neighbors closer together, one cautious step at a time.